Welcome to St. John. Nothing Happened Here, with your hosts Greg Marquis and Mark Allen Green, a show all about a little city on the east coast of Canada where nothing ever happened. Except for this.
Are you ready to time travel with us again? Today we're off to July 23rd, 1914. The world will be at war within just 2 weeks, but right now, there's a different war being fought in the streets of St. John. We find ourselves at the heart of the city, Market Square. There's a steep hill rising to the east of us, and we're at the very bottom. But we're not alone. Thousands and thousands are gathered around us. We feel as though we're being lifted off the ground and carried in a current of people pushing forward. Some are shouting angry words. Others seem as though they're watching a show. We overhear an older man speaking. He says this: "I wish we could go back to the old days before these blasted streetcars and the company that came with them. Those bigwigs don't care 2 pins about us. Just keep on taking more and giving less. Good on the boys for striking." Then we hear this: "Get ready, boys." It's a young man holding a rock. "We'll give the next trolley the same treatment as the last." From the conversations surrounding us, we start piecing together what has happened and what is happening. The recently unionized street railway workers are on strike, but non-unionized workers have been brought in to keep the service running. The last streetcar to travel by this area was met with a shower of rocks that broke every window and sent frightened passengers running. Some police officers tried to move in, but were chased down. Shots were fired, but no one knows anyone was hurt. We see a man climb onto a water fountain with a piece of paper in his hand. It is Mayor James Frink. He shouts at the top of his lungs, "Silence! Silence, everyone!" The crowd complies, likely out of curiosity rather than respect for their mayor. He clears his voice and begins to read. "Our sovereign lord the king charges and commands all persons being assembled immediately to disperse and peaceably to depart to their habitations or to their lawful businesses upon pain of being guilty of an offense on conviction of which they may be sentenced to life imprisonment. God save the king." The mayor has literally read the Riot Act, but no one moves. The silence slowly dies off, and all those around us continue doing what they're doing, like nothing even happened. No threat of imprisonment will disband this group, nor will the threat of the military intervening, which the reading of the Riot Act now allows. Everyone simply waits for the next streetcar to come and see the wrath of St. John taken out upon it. Before we know it, 45 minutes have passed. We hear something approaching, but it's not the clang of a streetcar. It's coming from up on King Street. The sounds start with low, rhythmic thuds, but steadily intensifies, drawing closer and closer. Does it sound like pounding horse hooves to you? Let's climb up that lamppost to get a better view. We get the view we need, but it's something we don't want to see. 7 heavy war horses are bearing down upon the crowd and us. They are mounted by men in military uniform with swords drawn at the ready. I'm sure they'll stop, just trying to intimidate us. They're 40 feet away, and still at full charging speed. 20 feet, 10. Screams rise from those who take the initial hit. Swords swing, rocks fly, chaos everywhere. Welcome to the 1914 streetcar riot. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. My name is Mark, and sitting over there, pounding back a coffee and ready to go is Greg. And that means it's St. John. Nothing happened here with the exception of the 1914 street railway strike that turned into the 1914 street railway riot. I'm excited to do this, Greg. I've been looking forward to this for a long time because it's our cover art. So the cover art for our podcast is the day after the major confrontation of this strike. And we should say, I think, that this was the last major riot in St. John.
There were other strikes. There was even another streetcar strike in 1921 with a bit of violence. And there were crowd incidents and things like that. But it's the last major act of social violence in St. John, early 20th century. But there were no deaths, few injuries, and few arrests and criminal prosecutions. But I think it's a really significant incident in our past, and it really tells us a lot about the city and some of the divisions within the city at the time.
And the scope of this was incredible, like how much of the city came out for this. But to get into the background of this, we have to get into what the streetcar was, because I was taken aback by how important of a public utility that the streetcar was. So can we give a little bit of background? Not much. We're going to do our notorious explaining everything on the streetcar and the labor in 10 minutes. But let's talk about streetcars in the 19th century, 20th century.
Well, streetcars really changed the city. It was the first mass transit, really, and they existed in St. John, maybe Moncton, and they affected the city. The other thing about the streetcar is that it was something that people had to pay to take. So they're kind of consumers who were never quite happy with any streetcar company, whether it was publicly owned or privately owned. This streetcar company, St. John, happened to be privately owned, and that, I think, created a lot of issues. So there's a great book I just want to mention, Loyola City Streetcars, A Story of Street Railway Transit in St. NB, which was published in 1979. If you find this book, it's really a gem, right? And it's very evocative. It takes us back to an earlier time. So trams or street railways originally were horse-drawn on rails, and that's how it started in St. John on the major routes.
I discovered that when I was doing research for the book, because in my mind, I really thought they were steam-powered. I thought they must have been. And then it was like, no, they were horse driven. I go, like, how would that work? But I guess there is some efficiency with having steel tracks, steel wheels, and make it easier for the horses to actually pull a very heavy load on, and especially with the bad conditions of the street. So it did work for a while. That started in 1866 with the People's Street Railway Company, which didn't last for too long.
No, and off and on till revived in the 1880s to 1893. And the problem with the horse-drawn trolleys is that you needed to feed and take care of the draft horses, and then someone had to fall behind the draft horses, Mark, with a big shovel and a bucket, right? Or a broom to clean up the mess.
20 pounds a day per horse of manure. And this is the other fun fact of this, which made it wasn't tenable to keep on going on with the horses. Each streetcar, how many horses did you have to have in the stable to support one streetcar? Because a horse could only last for about 4 or 5 hours at the best of times.
Right. You probably need 2 or 3 at least, right, for each car?
Try 10.
10. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So that's a lot of resources, a lot of grooming, a lot of feeding, a lot of manure.
And of course, in the weather, horse-drawn streetcars couldn't get through all the weather. And the other thing about the streetcar, just to talk about it as a transit, it helped people live in the suburbs and come into town. So it reshaped certain cities. It's been argued in urban history studies that it helped create suburbs. It brought more workers into the city, brought shoppers into the city, and it really became part of urban North America until the 1930s and 40s, right? And so that generation has passed now, but streetcars were synonymous with city life in the early 1900s, and St. John was part of that vibe.
Yes, but before that, what was the problem with being isolated to the city when you had to work in the commercial business district and you didn't have suburbs? What was happening before they got in with a streetcar service?
Well, overcrowding, poor housing. I mean, suburbs were mainly for middle-class people, but, they did allow some spread of the population, right, for sure. And St. John was affected by that. You can see we'll have some examples of how the streetcar lines were expanded through the years, right, to reach out to other areas of the city.
Can I give you a quote from Babcock on the conditions? I think this is a really good one. Okay. in his article about the 1914 strike. So jammed into substandard tenements in the Haymarket Square section of St. John, many workers yearned for clean air, sunshine, and a cottage of their own. And concluded one reformer, it is the low wages, high rents, and unsanitary, wretched houses that tend to produce the unhappy, discontented class of citizenship. And the only way to get out of that is to move to the suburbs. But how can you connect the suburbs to this when you didn't have automobiles?
That's right.
You didn't have any sort of mass transportation. This was essential. So we're starting to build up the essential service that this is. This is not just it's nice to have. Isn't it nice to have a subway in our modern cities? This is a necessity of life.
So electricity came along and it really revolutionized things because it provided a new type of motive power. And the thing that I was impressed by, these in the 1890s, when they started having electric streetcars in St. John, not only did they have electric lights, they had electric heaters for the winter, and that is really ahead of its time in a way, right? And so, so the overhead wires, just in terms of the tech, overhead wires carried the electrical current, and there was a little arm that ran up from the top of the streetcar to bring the current down. The current went into the rail itself. So the ground return was via street rails. And the St. John Street Railway Company, you can find a map online, or maybe we'll post it, had a developed system into the north end via Paradise Road and Main Street in the north end, and connected Douglas Avenue. But you had to get out and walk across the suspension bridge until a number of years later. And then there was a line on the west side at what later became Sims Corner, but it wasn't Sims Corner yet. It was called Asylum Corner. And then it went down to the Seaside Park. Yeah, well, that's where the psychiatric hospital was. And then it went down to the west side waterfront. So by the time of the strike, the city was fairly well connected by the system. But of course, people always wanted more, and they wanted better service, and they wanted cheaper fares.
And it was connected begrudgingly.
Yes,
and we got to get into this. This wasn't like, oh, we really want to expand this system. It's so 1893 would have been when electricity was introduced for the streetcars, that the electric streetcars came in. And it was originally the Consolidated Electric Company. That only lasted for, it's 5 years. And then it was bought out in 1897 by the St. John Railway Company. Yeah. Now, you're talking about the electricity. I'm glad you explained how these things worked, because this is what I didn't know about the railway, because I was like, okay, it's a streetcar, fine, and it's essential to try to connect the city, especially one that's starting to have that urban sprawl going into the suburbs. But this is the thing. It served as a public utility because it ran the electric company. You wanted lights, you had to use the streetcar system for electricity. It was the generator.
So the powerhouse was located on the corner of Dock and Union Street. And the other thing about these streetcars, they had two-man crew. One was the driver or the operator, and then the conductor who took the tickets and made change and maybe flirted with the ladies, as Babcock points out, right? In his article.
They did, because they were sharp dressed.
Yeah.
So they were dressed in their blue serge uniforms with cap, metal badge, and brass buttons. And I just happen to have a brass button from the St. John Railway Company.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I got one, and it is a Waterbury.
Oh, okay.
Which is like top of the line brass. They were well dressed, and I guess they were very coveted positions. So they weren't like looked upon as lowly civil servants. They were looked at, ooh, it's the motorman, it's the conductor of the streetcars. So 1893, everything was looking good. Everyone was excited, but that excitement went away quick, didn't it, Greg?
Well, public got fed up and they began to complain to local politicians. So at one point, the city threatened to expropriate the private company and make it a municipally owned company unless they improved their service. So there was a bit of a cat and mouse game. And just in terms of the geography of the system, Mark, the car barns, that's where they housed and repaired the cars when they weren't in service, and the horses maybe earlier on, I don't know.
Yeah.
And those car barns and repair shops were located on Wentworth Street. And I think part of that building is still there, which is amazing. And I think there was also a car barn on the west side and maybe one in the north end as well. So they had some infrastructure around the city as well. Of course, that powerhouse on Dock Street which had a generator that weighed more than 8 tons.
Yeah, no, it was huge. And it powered the city. So it powered residential. If you wanted residential electricity, you were going there. For commercial purposes as well. Now, I'm glad you mentioned that this threat for the municipality to take over, to expropriate the railway company, it didn't happen, but they had to cut a deal. The railway company had to cut a deal with the city, and the deal was you're responsible for snow removal on the roads and upkeep. So they really became part of the infrastructure. They were running the public works for the city, essentially.
Yeah. And they, and in 1914, it's a good sized workforce. By 1914, when the strike took place, there were over 100 men working for the streetcar company. So that leads us into organized labor, because I think the other thing about this story, it's not just a story of technology, it's a way of looking at the workers of the city who we haven't really paid much attention to yet in the podcast, right? The people actually built and ran the city, if you will, right? And the blue collar, skilled and unskilled workers. We talk about St. John as a city of entrepreneurs. Obviously, that's important. We look at many of their fine houses that survived the Great Fire and so forth. But those houses came at a price in many ways, right? That often made by capitalists who employed labor. And so there's workers here, and some of them were parts of unions, and unions were seen at the time as kind of part of social reform in general. Most workers were not in unions, but St. John was becoming a bit of a union town. And I think the 1914 strike really brings that into view.
St. John was not happy with the St. John Railway Company. And then you get the labor component. And as you said, St. John's a big labor town. The first labor union came in St. John. That would have been 1849.
I think so, yeah.
1849 with longshoremen getting a 10-hour day. So they fought hard for the 10-hour day. So there was a lot of union beginnings to St. John. So we could go through that for quite a while, but let's just bring it into the 1900s.
Building trades got an 8-hour day before World War I, which is impressive.
1913, 8-hour workday. Just to contrast, railway workers, so the conductors and the motormen, were working 10-hour workdays 7 days a week.
Yeah.
So then they started looking at what the longshoremen and other people were getting, building trades were getting, and it was like, ew. So that started that flavor for what was happening in 1913, 1914.
Which is why they formed a union in the first place, right?
Not giving workers tickets. I think that inflamed the labor movement, because a lot of cities did give discounts to workers.
If you're like a worker, yeah.
St. John Railway Company refused.
Yeah, and St. John was not the only place to have a streetcar strike. There were others that happened in Canada as well, for example, in Winnipeg in 1906. And a lot of the details differed, but a lot of the story is the same. Public ownership, private profits, lack of consumer protection, the public interest not being protected, and then the use of police and strike breakers and private detectives, in some cases the militia, right? So what happened in St. John had played out in other cities in both Canada and the United States, and would continue to do so after 1914.
It gets nasty. Yeah. Now, we're in 1914 now. It originally, I believe it was a Van Horn operation. He was a transcontinental railway guy, so he was a big railway magnate. But later on, it switched to local owners. Should we give them the names?
For sure.
Okay. We have Hugh McLean.
Yep.
Now, he was an Orangeman, a lawyer, and just happened to be the militia officer for the 28th New Brunswick Dragoons, which is going to play into the story later on.
And Mark, he's also a Liberal member of Parliament at the time.
He's connected.
Right. So these guys have their bases covered. Yeah. Mark, future Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick. I just remember.
There you go. We're starting to see how this is shaping up, right? Yeah. And then we have another lawyer, like lots of lawyers, but Senator W.H. Thorne of the Thorne Hardware fame.
Yeah.
We have James Manchester of the Manchester Robertson Allison department store fame, and then R.B. Emerson, manufacturer of stoves, and I think had a hardware store, right?
Yes, and they specialize in making stoves and other hardware, and his house is kind of historic, in your post-fire neighborhood, 190 Germain Street. But I think Emerson's, I'm not sure it was him, but isn't there Emerson Castle in South Bay that's built? They start to build around 1915, so whether it was him or someone in his family, but that's a real landmark in that area outside of St. John, right?
Those are the owners. We don't know how much involvement they have, but we know the involvement of this gentleman, H.M. Hopper, general manager, went on to own a very successful lighting fixture company.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That lasted for quite a few years.
Okay, well, the union and the workers were not a big fan of Mr. Hopper in 1914.
Yes, and I was wondering how he bounced back to be such a successful local businessman after that. But he was a general manager, an accountant who rose through the ranks of the St. John Railway Company. And I think he was a major driver, but we can discuss that later. So we have the union being formed, and it's Local 663 of the Amalgamated Association of Street and Electric Railway Employees. And it was May 1st, 1914. So they stuck Fred Ramsey, he's important to this, Fred Ramsey in as the president of the union. Now, back then, you didn't have the same sort of laws. You had to get the company to agree to recognize the union as the bargaining agent.
Yeah, and so that there was a basic standoff here.
Let's tell the story, Greg, because this is a classic. So you had the original denial of the railway company to say, we're not going to recognize you. They do the classic thing, hiring a detective agency to spy on the union. And within 3 weeks, the firing.
And that's only revealed later, and it's revealed indirectly through something that happens later. But it was the Teal detectives from Montreal, but they were an American-based company that had an office in Montreal. They did a lot of anti-labor work and, working for insurance companies and anti-fraud and things like that. But as we shall see, the Teal detectives and the more infamous Pinkerton detectives, who both were operating in St. John during the strike, were known for strike-breaking services as well.
Yes, exactly. So the detective was tailing Fred Ramsey to try to find some dirt on him to get him ousted, and likely didn't happen. But within 3 weeks of unionizing, they caught him allegedly breaching the company rules by stopping his streetcar and going into a local saloon and having a drink.
Well, if it did happen, Mark, he was probably just talking to the local cop on the beat, because the local cops on the beat were doing the same thing, I'm sure, in 1914.
Exactly. But we're going to see how this plays on. So they go, hey, you violated the company rules. You went in for a drink. You're fired. And Fred Ramsey goes, no, I didn't. And that's when we brought in Aaron from Halifax.
Aaron Mosier. He's the head of the union. The union had different branches, right? So Aaron Mosier from Halifax, and he was president. He was very big with railway unions in Canada.
And he said, prove the allegations. That's all we're asking, prove the allegations, or we're going to walk. So they filed a request under the Industrial Disputes Investigation Act. All they wanted was a fair investigation. And that brought in the federal labor minister to go, okay, we're going to intervene, because they had the authority to demand a conciliation panel to arbitrate this issue. So it's a 3-member panel. The union was given a choice of a person to sit on that, and then the employer was given a choice, and there was a 3rd member. The company refused to appoint, trying to drag this on. So the federal minister was forced to come up with a appointee for that. 3-member panel does sit, and then they hear the story. And did anyone come in to give evidence on the side of the company to say, yeah, Fred was in that saloon? One guy.
One guy, the detective.
The detective, not even the company inspector, couldn't swear to it. And the saloon owner said, never happened. All the colleagues said, never happened. Fred said, never happened. And plus, they had some additional evidence come in that 3 people were told that we're going to hire you on this railway company, but you can't join the union. So this was all coming together. Conciliation Board came back with, we're ruling essentially in favor of the union, saying you got to prove these allegations. And what did the company say? They go pound sand, and then they go, okay, we're going to double down here. We're not just saying go pound sand, the Conciliation Board. We're going to put in these draconian rules to try to basically get the union out of this. They put it in, and they fire 8 guys right away. 11 in total, and they were let go for things like talking to the motorman, and breaching of another rule is having a motorman who is not in uniform being let on the car, and just happen to be replaced by what? Non-union.
Which is classic. They're trying to bring in, like, they're trying to break the union by bringing in, you call them, they're not on strike yet, but they're replacement workers, essentially, right?
So you have 11 guys were actually terminated, and they go, geez, you know what? If we let this go on any longer, we won't have anyone left. They're going to take us out one by one. So 3 a.m. on July 22nd, union votes to strike. So then we have the events of July 22nd. So you have 100 men out on strike. And what happens with the first skirmishes in the morning?
The men aren't doing anything other than parading. The thing about this strike is that it's friends and sympathizers of the men in the union. So the men in the union are maintaining discipline. So they asked some of the non-union members to come over to their side, and that worked with some cases, right, Mark? So in Fairville and Carleton, on the other side of the city, no one reported for work. A few men refused to join the union, and I think about 10 cars were operating that morning. Right. But the strikers tried to win public support by going on parades and going through the city. Right. And they did get a lot of support. People were walking to work, for the most part. Right. That was the first day. Nothing really untoward, nothing very violent happening that day in my memory, Mark. Right.
It started to form, I would say, the heat. So you had workers on strike. Then they were chanting, "We will walk. We will fight for freedom. Let everyone walk." And then the public started to turn against the replacement workers and calling them scabs. So you can see the heat building up. And I think that's an important thing that we see. July 22nd is the heat building up. The union, they're parading all over the city with their dress uniforms and brass band. They're met out by Douglas Avenue and Main Street. So that's over on that north end. They're met at the corner by 2,000 people. And then they start parading toward the uptown area, Union Street. And by the time they get there, there's about 7,000 or 8,000 residents. And remember, this is a city at the time. The city proper would have been 41,000 population, the greater area about 52,000. So this is a big portion of the city that's coming out to support them. And they have one demand, and one demand only: abide by the Conciliation Board's decision, which is a completely reasonable demand.
That's right.
July 23rd.
Yeah. Rumors, the rumor mill, right? So there's rumors of strikebreakers are coming in from Montreal. That often doesn't go over well in any city where local workers are on strike. And the idea that the employers are bringing in strikebreakers, mercenaries, whatever. And some replacement workers, others continue to come over the side of the striker. You get the first blocking of a trolley, right?
Yeah, there was I would call it a nonviolent intervention. Like there were people trying to stop them, like by taking a slow horse and going in front of the car so it couldn't speed up. So there was a lot of things going on in the daytime, but then we got the crowd forming in Market Square. I think it's important to note the two crowds forming. There was a crowd forming at King Square for an unrelated event, and it was a band concert.
Yeah, and for those non-locals, King Square is at the head of King, which is a steep hill that goes down to the waterfront, and at the bottom of King, there's Market Square. So you're right, there's two crowds, and the one forming at the bottom, I think, was just there waiting for something to happen, curious, rumor mill, and the thousands of people, right?
Again, 10,000 people from a town, city that size. One of the quotes from Albert Whipple, I was picked up literally and carried by the crowd. My feet weren't even touching the ground. And then comes a trolley, Greg. It's coming down Dock Street, which is now St. Patrick Street, towards the crowd, which I got to wonder, like, did they have no idea what was going on? Like, come on, I wouldn't be driving a trolley in a strike towards 10,000 angry people, but they did. 10,000 people. There happened to be a sewer project. They grabbed some rocks and they started pummeling the cars. And it had passengers, and it had women and children. So they had the frightened passengers being showered with glass. Conductor tried to fight off the crowd with an iron bar.
Yeah, metal bar, and he hit someone.
Hits a guy in the head.
Yeah.
And that's not going to pacify a crowd of 10,000 people. So they let the people off, the passengers, but they would not let the replacement workers, and it was go time on them. So they were just able to get free with the help of local police, which there weren't many police around. There were only 40 in the force at the time, and a lot of them were gone by that time of the day. The
chief of police didn't make any special provision for putting extra men on duty, but there were problems going on with the police at the time. Then things start to kick off, as they say in England, and some of the these are young boys and young men for the most part. They're not strikers. We have to keep reminding our listeners they're not strikers, but some glass windows in stores in the area, including Thorne's Hardware. Senator Thorne being one of the owners of the company, but nothing is stolen, which is very interesting. So it's very focused violence on certain store windows. In a sense, the crowd has some discipline. Yeah, the police officer Lucas, what happens with him?
He tried to make an arrest in a crowd of 10,000 people, and good luck on Fred Lucas. It didn't go well. He was assaulted. He got cornered by a store, and he shot 3 shots into the air to alert people he needed help. And that didn't do anything. And then he shot 2 shots into the ground. One injured someone in the leg, and then they went at him hard. They almost pushed him through the store window. He only was able to barely escape with the help of one of the detectives, the company detectives.
Yeah.
So it's getting heated.
Yeah, and the police chief was later faulted, after the dust settled, and his thing was that we did our best. But to be fair, the city was not really spending a lot on the number of policemen. The police kept saying we're understaffed here and that type of thing. So the ferry arrives from the west side, and off the ferry comes.
It was the men of the Union with their brass band.
Yeah, they're coming back from parading and winning public support in the west side, and they just happened to stumble parading into this near riot scene. I'm not sure it's a full-fledged riot yet. It's a bit of rough stuff and some windows being smashed. I think the term riot is a bit exaggerated. However, the mayor thinks it's a riot. Why?
Mayor Joseph Frink reads the Riot Act.
Yeah.
So he gets on the SPCA fountain, which is still in front of City Hall. Worth taking a look at if you're in St. John. So he gets up and he reads the Riot Act. This is important because the mayor, it still exists in law today. And once you read the Riot Act, everyone has to disperse. If they don't, they could face life imprisonment.
That's the high end, but the low end is at least a year or 2 in jail, whatever. I think there was a spectrum there. But yeah, it's very serious. It's very serious.
So Mayor Frink reads that, saying you could be under penalty of life imprisonment if you don't move. The crowd goes quiet. 10,000 people go quiet. No one moves, though.
That's right.
They're not going. So that's not working.
Yeah. So Police Chief Walker Clark could not contact a local militia, because what happens we've talked about this before in some of our episodes. If you read the Riot Act, then you can call on the military or militia in aid of the civil power to clear the streets. How do you get that message through? They could not. The police chief could not contact the local militia commanders because they're at their summer cottages, right?
Yep.
And so he asked the judge to contact a local military establishment at Barrack Green in the South End, and who was visiting at Barrack Green to do some training with the local militia.
7 out-of-town guys.
Yeah.
Dragoons.
Yeah. Royal Canadian Dragoons, and I think some of them had fought in the South African War. So Hubert Stethan was a lieutenant. He was the officer in command of this small body of cavalry troopers. So what do?
They come up with a brilliant idea. They take their horses. They're on horseback. They have ceremonial swords. They don't have their actual combat sword. They make their way up to King Street. Stethan, he gives the orders going full on charge towards the bottom of the hill and 10,000 people. They went full charge. No warning given.
And there were women and children and elderly people in the crowd, and a number of people were injured by the swords and being knocked over by horses and being pushed down in the general commotion and panic that ensued, right?
Yeah, and cut by swords, by the blunt swords. Like there was injuries to the face, injuries to people's hands. People were knocked unconscious. When you have heavy horses too, these are war horses coming down into a crowd. That's dangerous to begin with. But the crowd got a couple of licks in. What did they do to good old Hubert?
I think they threw bricks and bottles, and also the cavalry, the troopers actually chased people up onto the sidewalk. right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so the crowd, once they saw women being knocked down and threatened, then that really outraged a lot of them, and they start fighting back, by throwing
They
things.
fought back. They fought back. So Hubert, he ends up taking a rock to the face, broken nose, black eye, and disfigured. Another of the dragoons ends up getting a rock smashed in his hand when he's trying to defend himself. He breaks his hand. And 2 horses were slashed. Now, you might think that's the crowd being cruel, but I'm sure it was to defend themselves.
Stetson later interviewed in the newspaper. He just strikes you as kind of an arrogant guy. He's like tone deaf to the fact that civilians were injured. And he basically says, well, they're lucky we didn't have a real source. It's incredible to read that. So I think, didn't Robert Babcock, who's written the classic article on this strike, describe this as the most foolhardy cavalry charge in Canadian history?
Yeah, I think that's apt.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't understand why they didn't announce it or try to use intimidation first before a full-on charge, but this is what happened. Yeah. And that infuriated the 10,000 people. So now the dragoons withdrew and they go, okay, they started chanting, burn the cars, turn it over, as 2 more make their way down Dock Street towards the crowd. Again, like, what are they doing? Like, why would they just go, we're not going to be pushing a crowd of 10,000 people, but they do it and they go, burn the cars, turn them over, and they attack the cars. They let the passengers go, but they start trying to push over these huge cars, which they're heavy. They weren't able to. It took 50 men. They had to get a bunch of rope from some of the ships to be able to finally haul them over. But they weren't done with that. So cheers go up, and then they go, the powerhouse, put out the lights. The company has no friends. Give it to them, boys. They don't own this town tonight. And they went up to the power plant. It was really close. Dock and Union, where Aquatic Center is now, Dave, if you're familiar with St. John. And what do they do to the generators?
Well, they chase the employees out, they break windows, and they dump a bag of cement onto the generator, and the lights go out in St. John, power to the railway as well to anyone with electricity. Now, the generator will be fixed shortly, but St. John was now in the dark. And as Babcock points out, business owners became worried. They came into town to check on their properties. They were worried about looting. But, to their credit, the crowd was not venting its anger on the businesses of the city. It was venting its anger on the company and having just been attacked by out-of-town soldiers from Ontario.
Yep. Okay, so they're riled up, and then they go, okay, we're not done. Let's go to the barns on Wentworth Street.
On the way to the barns, what do they do to the cars? What do they try to do?
Burn them.
They set them on fire, but again, the fire department comes, and to their credit, the crowd does not stop the firefighters from dousing those flames. And Mark, I found out from that Loyalist City streetcar book, it's an odd detail, but one of those cars remained in service until 1948.
Oh, they got it back after having it overturned and burned. And Babcock, there's 2 different accounts that I read about it, but Babcock said that the rioters were the ones that hit the alarm, the fire alarm. Got because they were going, we're sending a message, we don't want to burn down the town. The rioters were given a bad reputation, but it was very targeted and very purposeful.
Now we're heading to the denouement of the evening, and of course we have to repeat that it's not strikers. The union is staying out of this, right? It's not all 10,000 people. It's boys and young men. But here's where we first hear about private detectives, right? I mean, in a major way, right?
Yeah, I think they were suspected to be in town, but we got a full dose that they were in town when the rioters, a contingent of them, went past. They would have went past the King Street Band concert, which hopefully was over by then. But anyway, they made their way to Wentworth Barn, and they were saying, the car barns, where are the strike breakers from Montreal? So they start screaming out that they want to have the scabs. And that's when the detectives were behind there. There were 15 Thiel and I think 10 Pinkerton detectives.
So, some from Montreal, some from Boston.
And first they did a couple warning shots in the air, but then they did fire buckshot at the crowd.
Yeah, there's different accounts. I mean, at least one pistol shot in the air and at least one private detective firing buckshot. And a person by the name of Frank Thorne, who was described as a lad, was injured. Luckily, there was only one person injured. But after that, the sympathizers pulled back, right, Mark? and things were done for the evening.
They go, we're not going up against guns. So they pulled back. That was the end of the evening. Everyone went home. But not Mayor Frank. 3 a.m., he gets an automobile to take him to the home of Colonel James McAvity of the McAvity fame. He was a senior militia officer and said, we need the militia in here. So the militia are deployed. 500 local militia called into active service. Each soldier was issued 25 rounds of ammunition, and they bring in the 28th Dragoons armed with combat swords.
Yeah, these were the 28th Dragoons were not the same guys that ran down King Street. These were the local militia cavalry, and these were the people that the Royal Canadian Dragoons were meant to train. So what's really interesting about that dynamic, you've got you've got several hundred local citizen soldiers who are supposedly securing the city, but a lot of them would have been related to, worked with, neighbors of, and friends with the men on strike, and also many of the men in the crowd. So McAvity's interesting for military history because a few years later, he's going to organize the famous 26th Battalion in St. John of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and later he's going to be court-martialed and dismissed for conspiracy to defraud the battalion. But again, these soldiers were armed, and accounts varied as to how hardcore they were with the local people. They did keep guard at the car barns with the rifles and bayonets, but in terms of what they did with the rest of the city, you get mixed reports, right, Mark, in terms of how serious they were.
This is shaping up to be worse than day number one. So we have in the day, cleanup was happening. Then the evening, a large crowd begins to form again on King Street Hill. Now, they are being stubborn, the company. They're still running the streetcars even after the day before. And they want to have the militia escort the streetcars, and the militia refuse.
Yeah.
They go,
That's
not
right.
Our job. We're not doing it. So you can see where the sympathies, I think, of the local militia even lay with this. Like, we'll do our job, but we're not escort services. Well, I shouldn't say that. That didn't sound right.
They're not,
services.
They're not brought in from outside. They're people from the community, right? So there was one incident where Colonel McLean, quite stubbornly, I think, he tries to ride shotgun, not with a shotgun, but he tries to get on a car, and that does run into some trouble, but I don't think the reception isn't quite as violent, right, as the other incidents.
He has to back away quick. They cannot get through the crowd. So that was a power move, and it didn't work well. So things are getting really heated. The mayor gets all the taverns in town to agree to shut down, so to try not add alcohol fuel to the fire. But everything is sounding like it's going really bad until about 11:30 p.m. when the news comes in that a deal has been negotiated.
A number of prominent politicians have been at work. James T. Hazen, a former Conservative Premier, William Pugsley, a former Liberal Premier, and Conservative MLA John B. Baxter, who also was a city recorder, which is a type of judge, and a future Premier. And the deal came through. The promise was that the men could go back to work. I guess the union is going to be recognized in that sense, but the company would not hire Ramsey back. So the deal then was the city of St. John agreed to give him a job, right? And then and then the other men who were dismissed, I mean, many of them were reinstated, but then the case of two of them would be examined down the road, right?
In accordance with the labor conventions at the time.
So people were ready to go back to work. People were happy, but the company also had claims against the city, right? For the damaged car, the damaged power plant, things like that.
And they didn't get any traction on that.
No, but Baxter, who's going to be a premier in the 20s, who also wrote a book on the history of the militia in St. John, by the way, he becomes a bit of a local hero for his role in ending the strike. And I'm sure that helped his political fortunes, right? But it is interesting that these high-placed politicians were involved in labor negotiations.
Yes. Now, the aftermath, let's go to what did this do to the city?
Well, I mean, it brought labor peace for now, but that doesn't solve all the problems. But in terms of the legal outcomes, as we've seen before with some of our other episodes, it's hard to prosecute people in riots because you can't always identify them. So only 2 people in the end were convicted, and very odd, Mark. Comments on a lawyer here. They're told to leave town. They're sentences that you have to leave town.
I don't know if banishment was ever in the criminal code of Canada. Like, I think it was unofficial. Like, like the one guy was an American, so they said, get on the next schooner, get back to America. The other guy was a local, and they said, you can't come back for 2 years. I don't know what the authority for that. Maybe it was like some alternative sentencing or something like that, where they get them to agree to. But so that happened. I think more would have happened, but it got overshadowed pretty quick, this event, by another huge event. And what was it?
Well, okay, the strike was settled on the evening of the 24th of July. On the 29th of July, St. John newspaper readers learned of the outbreak of a war between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and everyone hoped for the best, that it would lead to everything. By early August, Canada is at war because Britain has declared war on Germany. So
bigger problems than streetcars right now.
Yeah, and people like Stretton, who had been the bad guy leading that crazy cavalry charge, are going to be the heroes in the war, right? So the streetcars continue, and then actually you're entering the golden age of the streetcar service. The 1920s extensions extend along Manawaganish Road. In the east, it's extended into Simons Parish, past the new dry dock. There's a new dry dock opened in 1923 in East St. John. Rosse Avenue all the way out to Glen Falls, which was the new residential area, right, Mark, in at that time. And then in 1916, because there's a new bridge over Reversing Falls, the streetcars could actually go across that bridge for the people not having to get out and walk, right? Mm-hmm. So the company sold during World War I. It's less profitable, so it sold to the New Brunswick Power Company. And there's, some of those labor issues do not disappear because the new company to cut costs will raise revenues. Will put the first ever fare increase, 6 cents for a fare and 1 cent for a transfer. They also want one-man cars to save on labor costs. That produces a strike with more violence, but not on the level of 1914. And then, Mark, during the 20s, that's the heyday. There's 7 million passengers in 1929
in St. John.
Well, overall, if you take 7 million fares.
So people riding it 250 days of the year.
And I know people who remember taking the streetcar as kids. They're elderly now, right? And then in 1933, because of the Great Depression, that drops off, 4.6 million. But then there's a rebound during World War II when there's a lot of workers and some military people in the town. Of course, people aren't able to buy cars and tires and things like that. So there's 11 million passengers in 1945. But by this time, the companies brought in buses. So buses are now part of that transit system. And buses have a lot of advantages over streetcars. By 1943, only 3 routes remain in use. And by 1948, the last year of the streetcars, there's only 3 routes in use. And if you read that book, it's very sad, really, the last part of the book where it talks about the last streetcar run in August 1948, right?
Do they have a picture of that in the book? The last streetcar?
No, not of that. They have a picture of car 142, but it wasn't commemorated at the time. But by this time, buses were the way of the future. City gave a franchise to SMT to operate a bus service, and the company sold off its cars and its streetcars. And so car 142 made the last trip from the car barn in the south end to Main Street North, picking up a few people on the way in the dark. So there were very few people around to see what was going on. Back down to King Square, past the area where the riot took place, up Haymarket Square, up King Street, and then down to Wentworth Street and to the car barn. And that's the end of the streetcar era in St. John.
Now, please tell me that car 142 still exists, that it went into a museum.
No, I don't think so. I think people might know this, but some of those cars were sold off. People use them as cottages and diners and all sorts of things. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know if anyone ever has any information.
Please reach out if you know any of the St. John streetcars. If anyone has it in their back acres, please let us know. We would love to know what happened to them, see a picture or something like that. Yeah. So Greg, another way to measure the impact of an event is how long it resonates. And get this, Greg, it's been 111 years since the St. John streetcar strike, and there is an English literature professor at the University de Moncton, Thomas Hod, who wrote a play surrounding the events of 1914 strike. And Greg, get this. That play, entitled O'Brien, is being produced by Theatre New Brunswick, premiering on March the 5th. And finally, Greg, get this. We have Thomas Hod on the show today. Professor Hod, welcome to St. John. Nothing happened here.
Pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So, without any spoilers, Professor Hod, can you tell us a bit about O'Brien?
Admittedly, Mark, I don't know how many spoilers I can offer in the sense that it's based on the historical events of July 22nd to 24, 1914. So in that sense, there won't be any real surprises. I guess the difference between the history that you two have participated in the segment and what I was interested in terms of putting it on stage as a play is focusing not so much on the events, but trying to tell the story through the perspective and eyes of those who experienced the events firsthand. I wouldn't call this play an historical drama in the conventional sense. I'm more inclined to describe it as a heritage drama.
Okay.
I made the conscious decision to write a play in which I tried to keep the majority of the events of 22nd to 24 July as the main plot or narrative line. But instead of focusing on the big public figures of those events, Mayor Frank, Colonel McCavity, Fred Ramsey, Lieutenant Stetson, the Dragoons, and so on, I wanted to instead go, this is more about the workers. And so I wanted to create a family not just of workers, but those who are also part of what in part drew me to this event. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it also happened right before, it was on the eve of the First World War. It also was right at the height of suffragism. And so you have this kind of conflation of what I call this trinity of tensions, the social, the political labor, and the women's suffragists all coming together. And I wanted to try and capture those tensions through the lens of a family that was experiencing the strike and so I wanted to add the Irish Catholic history of St. John. And so I have it through the lens of this fictionalized Irish St. John family, O'Brien. And so you also have the Protestant Catholic tension operating within the story as well.
Okay, so lots of layers happening here.
Yeah, I tried my best.
I'm sure you did well. I wish I was in New Brunswick so I could see it. Unfortunately, I'm in Alberta, but I'm sure Greg's going to go see the show when it plays in St. John.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
So, Thomas, this is a podcast about St. John.
Yeah.
And you've written two plays, maybe more, but two plays have been produced about St. John. What is it about the city that attracts you as a playwright?
Well, a couple of reasons. I think the main one is that I was born in St. John and grew up first in the East End in Champlain Heights and then moved out to KV and grew up there, did my schooling there. So as you both know, even if you live out in KV in the suburbs of St. John is the place to go to get anything really. And so that was one of the reasons that I'm always drawn to St. John on a personal level. And then just the sheer richness that St. John offers in terms of its past, its culture. It's just such a vibrant, tumultuous city, rough. It doesn't have that kind of, it doesn't have that allure, that majestic allure that, the city of Fredericton has, right? And those historical portrayals between the two, and the dock street and the roughness, that grittiness that St. John offers, right? And so
it has its own charm.
Yeah, absolutely. This play's been germinating for over 30 years, admittedly.
Oh, wow.
When I was early in my undergrad, this is going back to the early 90s, I landed a job for the summer as a historical interpreter at the New Brunswick Museum in Market Square. And what we had to do was there were objects in the museum, and so we had to write up little sketches in order to tell the story of those objects in the museum. So that was my job. And one of the stories that they handed me was the St. John Street Railway strike and the riot. And embarrassingly, as most happens in this country and in this province, we aren't taught our history and our own stories. And so I was, both amazed and embarrassed that I didn't know the story. And so I had to write up this little sketch, and I put on this, pseudo military uniform, and I told this, capsule story to tourists about the St. John Street Railway strike. And so that's where it began.
A summer job can be important later in life.
Yeah, absolutely. You never know where it's going to take you, right?
It can be, and it explains so much, Thomas, because I was like wondering, like, this is a major event. It is in St. John history, but it's relatively unknown. And like, where did you come up with this? Because like, I always fancied myself a St. John history buff, and I hadn't heard about this. Yeah. So it's a lot of these major events just become this forgotten history. So it's good that you, 111 years afterwards, and that resonated with you and it kept with you for 30 years, you bring it back to life and through the stage.
And that's what I'm trying to do. You know, I'm not a screenwriter and I don't have the money to write a film because, of course, as you both know, this would make an amazing film. Oh, yeah. In terms of, you know, the cavalry charge and the riots and the overturned and the generators knocked out and the militia, like it would just be this amazing, you know, film if someone had the money and resources. And since I didn't have that, I thought, you know, I'll at least try to see if it could work on stage.
You can't write this stuff.
You really can't. And probably like the two of you, whenever you tell anyone the story about the St. John Street Railway strike and the riot, people are like, are you kidding me? Yeah. That's amazing. I never heard of that. And you're like, yeah, it happened.
So it sounds like in terms of what the audience takeaway would be to, you know, to see some issues from the past being portrayed in a more intimate setting.
Yeah, I guess that's partly what I was interested at the end of the day, Greg, was not just telling the salient details of the riot, but trying to get at part of the reality. I mean, I would never call this a labor play. Like, it's not an agitprop in that sense. What I was really interested in exploring is this central idea that history is not made up of the big public. It's actually made up of the everyday choices of everyday people. And that's those minute everyday choices that effectively move us along as a society. So I was interested in exploring ideas of sacrifice, loyalty, resilience. In any event, part of the reason for finally getting down and having the space was I couldn't help in the last few years, including both during and over the pandemic, that these tensions that were so prevalent in 1914 on the eve of First World War were echoing right now in our time. So you have, 2023 was named the year of the strike. You have this new wave of feminism approaching and coming about and being much more politically active. And then the third part of that, we had the Russian incursion into Ukraine, and you have everyone on edge in the sense of, is this a regional conflict? Is it going to become larger? And so I really saw these resonances with what was happening today in our time right now with what had happened back in that eve of First World War in St. John. So that in a way is what made me go, I think it's time. I think it's time to try and tell the story again.
Right? It's kind of cool that it's going to be on tour to several New Brunswick communities, right?
Yeah, I'm really excited by that. TNB has got it all set. It's starting the week of March 5th at the TNB space in Fredericton before it's starting to move around in different places around the province. It's going to then move on to St. John, one night only. For all you listeners in St. John, one night only at the Imperial. You're going to be watching a play in the middle of where the events were taking place, which would be, it'd be such an amazing, I'm going, just because I want to have that sense of being, this is actually where it happened.
The ghosts of the past are surrounding you as this play's going on.
Yeah, and then the 11th, it moves on to the Moncton area. It'll be at the Riverview Art Center on March 11th. And then from there, it moves on to Miramichi and Dalhousie and Florenceville and St. Andrews before returning back to Fredericton. It's such a gift to be allowed and to have people like Natasha McClown and TNB to take up this story and to tell it to New Brunswickers again, or even for the first time, right? Because I think, as you two can appreciate, and as I see myself as a professor of Canadian literature and in fact Atlantic literature, that so few of our own stories are being told, both to the public and in the classroom. And it becomes not necessarily, it does. It becomes disheartening in a way. We have such a rich, vibrant culture and history, and that it doesn't get told enough. And I think this happens a lot in New Brunswick is that people go, oh, that's a St. John story. That's not a Fredericton story. That's not a Moncton story. That's not a, St. Stephen or St. Andrew story. When in fact, as you probably both have already talked about, this is not just in New Brunswick or St. John story. This is a Canadian story. Mm-hmm. Like these kinds of strikes and labor strife were so rampant during that last/first decade of the 20th century. And then the return after the end of the First War. But everybody talks about, Winnipeg General Strike. That's all we need to talk about. And then we move on. Yeah. And it's so frustrating.
So I couldn't agree with you more about us not learning our own history. And that's why Greg and I have put together this podcast. And we called it St. John Nothing Happened Here because that's the perception. But that's not the truth. And we spend every episode trying to dispel that belief and disprove the name of our show. I went to St. John High School. Okay. And I wish my history teacher just took us outside, took us for a walk down Prince William Street. Because that could have been an entire class just going from St. John High School to Market Square in the history that little segment of St. John has. So thank you, Thomas, for bringing this important story back to life. And I hope it does extremely well. And I'm sure it will. And should say, too, way to go. Theatre New Brunswick is a nationally renowned theatre company. Theatre New Brunswick puts on an amazing show every time, without exception.
And they have such a rich history. And I have to also commend Natasha and TNB because of her and their collective commitment to telling New Brunswick stories.
Yeah, and kudos to Theatre New Brunswick.
I'm very excited about personally to see this, but also just the fact that all these things you've talked about. It's about New Brunswick, but has a broader, it's universal as well. So, and just the fact that it's taking place in the heart of the city, in the historic Imperial Theater, at least, that's really cool, I think.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
And Thomas, did you have any last things you want to add?
I'd like to thank the two of you again for being able to, give a quick discussion of how I play into your podcast and its importance. And so I'm very honored to be here and to offer a few tidbits surrounding what I hope audiences will thoroughly enjoy. And the other part of that, I think, is you can both appreciate people don't just watch the play and walk away, right? One hopes that there will be an afterlife and that there'll be discussions, right? It's not just about relying on, scholarly historians like you, Greg, and others, or public historians, like Harold Wright or Goss or Andrew McLean. It's also about the community, right? It's the story of community. And so I'm hoping that can spur some energy and interest and others wanting to, dig into our past.
Yeah, there's value in entertainment, bringing an interest in history. So it's a good approach for getting people excited about things that they should be excited about because we have exciting history in St. John. Yeah. But thank you, Thomas and Greg. Yeah. 1914 Street Railway Strike. Last and largest act of social violence in St. John. And that is the podcast. And Greg, Thomas, proof once again. St. John, nothing happened here.
Thank you for listening to St. John, Nothing Happened Here. To learn more, join us at www.nothinghappenedhere.ca or connect with us on Facebook. Other means of communication include, but are not limited to, telegrams, smoke signals, and carrier pigeons. However you want to reach us, we want to hear from you.